Good evening and welcome to NTD News. I'm Stephania Cox. Here are today's top stories. New York City sees a record death toll 2 days in a row. But on a positive note, the numbers seem to be leveling off. It's the end of the road for Bernie Sanders, the Vermont senator today suspending his presidential campaign, all but handing the Democratic nomination to Joe Biden. Tens of thousands were projected to leave the city of Wuhan on Wednesday after authorities lifted a 2-month lockdown. Some tell us what it's like. And we explore some of the challenges facing people in self-isolation. A psychologist gives his tips on how to cope. In New York, record deaths 2 days in a row. But it looks like the virus's plateau is on the horizon, if not there already. NTD's Miguel Moreno has more.
Another day of record deaths in New York. Nearly 800 on Tuesday, all patients infected with a disease caused by the CCP virus.
The bad news isn't just bad. The bad news is actually terrible. Highest single-day death toll yet, 779 people.
Cuomo said the number may continue to rise as patients hospitalized for longer periods pass away. But there's good news. With the hospitalization rate down more and more, it's looking like New York has reached the plateau.
We took dramatic actions in this state. New York paused program that closed down schools, businesses, social distancing, and it's working. It is flattening the curve.
Mayor Bill de Blasio also reminded New Yorkers not to jump the gun and asked them to double down on preventative measures.
We know from some other parts of the world that they started to see a little bit of progress, took their foot off the gas, let down their guard, and guess what? This awful, ferocious disease started to reassert itself.
And the progress has been dramatic. On ventilators alone, the city said last week it would need 200 to 300 more per day. Now de Blasio says it looks like they have enough to get through this week. Miguel Moreno, NTD News, New York.
And in New York, medical workers are exhausted. They're working hard to beat the overwhelming odds.
The coronavirus pandemic is taking its toll on New York City's first responders, both physically and mentally. 17-year-old paramedic Anthony Almahera says it's been one of the hardest times in the department's history.
I don't know if any of us will ever be the same after this. And that's something we're going to have to manage. There's going to be a lot of trauma from this for the medics and EMTs who have seen this all, unfold, firsthand, being on the front line.
The first responder says the fact that they are unable to hug and comfort infected patients makes it even harder.
Normally we can get, closer to people. I could put my hand on their shoulder or provide comfort, or the medics and the EMTs do that, comfort the living when we can't save someone. But during this pandemic, we have to keep our distances. It doesn't allow us to get that personal like we used to. And that takes its toll, too, because you want to be there for people.
The department went from an average of 4,000 calls to almost 7,000, putting a strain on EMTs and paramedics. New York City accounts for the majority of the nearly 5,500 deaths in the state, which in turn represents about 45% of the nation's total loss of life to date.
And an update on the virus in the U.S. The country currently reports over 420,000 infected and over 14,000 deaths. One key model shows the eventual American death toll may be lower than forecast. But despite the promising news, officials across the country warn not to let up on social distancing measures.
A key projection offering promising signs, expecting fewer U.S. coronavirus deaths by August, down to roughly 60,000 from recent forecasts between 80 and 90,000. That modeling from the University of Washington indicates social distancing measures are making a difference. While states like New York and Michigan close in on peaks this week, states like Florida and New Jersey are bracing and preparing for theirs potentially later this month.
We're sourcing personal protective equipment literally around the world. We need more, so we're frantically, and we've been on this, trying to stay out ahead of this as best we can.
Among emerging hotspots eyed by the White House Coronavirus Task Force are Philadelphia and the Baltimore-Washington corridor.
We continue asking all of our residents to stay home when not engaged in essential activities.
Nationwide, the University of Washington model forecasts a peak demand for resources like hospital beds and ventilators on or around Saturday, and a peak daily death toll on or around Sunday.
Automaker General Motors is getting a $500 million contract to make ventilators for CCP virus patients. It's the first ventilator contract under the Defense Production Act. President Trump invoked the act to get companies to produce essential supplies. GM says it will deliver the first few thousand ventilators by June 1st and 30,000 by the end of August. The company saying it can supply more if needed. It's spending hundreds of millions to retool its factories and suppliers. Ford is also planning to produce tens of thousands of ventilators in the next 100 days. And in the UK, anger is growing over the Chinese regime and its attempts to cover up the CCP virus. Politicians warn that disinformation is costing lives. Our UK correspondent Jane Werrell has more.
The Chinese Communist Party failed to disclose vital information about the initial coronavirus outbreak and has breached international law, according to findings in a new report that says the Chinese regime should be sued.
We have to continue to apply pressure on the Chinese authorities to share all and every bit of information that they possess for the greater good of humanity. And if they show any unwillingness to do that, we need to make certain that they're held accountable.
The report, published by the UK foreign policy think tank Henry Jackson Society, says China could be liable to compensate the world's top 7 economies at least $4 trillion.
If you allow a rogue state like this get close to you, whether you are Iran or Britain, you're in trouble. Now we're in trouble because we have far too much in our setup already, which gives the Chinese pressure points that they can apply to us.
Several lawsuits have already been launched in the US, suing the regime for the economic damage the pandemic has caused to Americans. Some British lawmakers are criticising the CCP's initial cover-up of the pandemic. Politicians from the UK's Foreign Affairs Committee said that disinformation from China is costing lives. British politician Ian Duncan Smith, former leader of the UK Conservative Party, says Chinese disinformation is happening on an enormous scale and the behaviour can no longer continue.
They seem now to be putting out misinformation all over the place about where this started, even trying to blame the United States. Some blamed Italy and said it's had an outbreak in September and didn't tell anybody. Many other countries have had enough of this behavior by China, and it doesn't look like it's going to stop.
Unreliable figures and information from China means that the true scale of the tragedy within China remains unknown. As the virus continues to take lives and infect people both inside and outside of China, people here are wanting answers. Jane Werrell, NTD News, London.
Earlier today, the UK Finance Minister confirmed the largest one-day rise in deaths. At 938, it brings the total to over 7,000 deaths in the UK. And more on Europe. Spain's daily death count is also on the rise again. And in Italy, ports are tightening restrictions for ships carrying migrants.
The number of daily coronavirus deaths rose in Spain as 757 people died over the past 24 hours. The total fatalities in the country is now over 14,000. Patients are sometimes transported to areas with more hospital capacity. To prepare, Spanish paramedics simulated transporting virus patients on a high-speed train. The trains have a capacity of 24 patients and can travel across the country. Charity ships which rescue migrants on the coast of Libya are no longer allowed to dock at Italian ports. This is because the ports aren't considered safe during the epidemic. The new measure has support from across the political spectrum, with staunch migration advocates also signing on. What might look like medieval Europe is actually Vienna under lockdown. Horse-drawn carriages delivering meals. The carriage owners usually survive off tourists. But since hotel stays are banned right now, business is slow. so some drivers are using their free time to deliver the 200 to 300 free meals prepared by a local hotel. The meals mostly go to the elderly and most vulnerable.
It's the end of the campaign trail for Bernie Sanders. The Vermont senator dropped out of the race today. It was his second bid for presidency.
Following a string of primary election defeats, Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders suspended his campaign on Wednesday.
We are now some 300 delegates behind Vice President Biden, and the path toward victory is virtually impossible.
Sanders announced the news in a live-streamed speech to supporters from his hometown of Burlington, Vermont.
And while we are winning the support of so many young people and working people throughout the country, I have concluded that this battle for the Democratic nomination will not be successful.
His departure makes former Vice President Joe Biden the presumptive nominee to face President Trump in the November 3rd election. The president reacted quickly on Twitter. He wrote, "Bernie Sanders is out," adding that this ended just like the Democrats and the DNC wanted, the same as the crooked Hillary fiasco. The Bernie people should come to the Republican Party. Trade. The 78-year-old Democratic Socialists' strongly progressive agenda pulled the party sharply to the left. At first, he shot up to an early lead in the Democratic race, but faded quickly after losing South Carolina in late February, as moderate Democrats consolidated their support behind Biden. He's also been under pressure to halt his campaign after Biden won resounding victories in primary contests in Florida, Arizona, and Illinois.
The Attorney General is preparing to lead a new committee dedicated to protecting the telecom network in the U.S. He says protecting the network is both a national security and a public safety issue.
Attorney General William Barr is set to head a new committee. It's designed to review national security concerns arising from foreign-owned companies, specifically those who want to participate in the U.S. telecoms network. President Trump formalized the committee via executive order on April 4th. Its main purpose is to review licenses and applications from foreign-based companies to determine national security and law enforcement risks. After review, the committee will advise the Federal Communications Commission on the best way to respond to the risks. The options include denying an application, providing a conditional grant, or modifying or revoking a license. Also joining the team, Secretary of Defense Mark Esper and Acting Homeland Security Director Chad Wolf. The order comes after the FCC denied China Mobile's application to provide telecom services in the U.S. The Delaware-based company is a subsidiary of the state-owned China Mobile Limited. The FCC says ultimately it's controlled by the Chinese regime.
Coming up, people leaving China's virus epicenter tell us what it's like getting out after a 2-month lockdown. That and more after the break.
They were working on developing a coronavirus for the human host. It leads you to question, why would you be creating a coronavirus that can infect humans?
That means virus now can infect human cells much easier.
I noticed that after the outbreak, the Wuhan Institute of Virology kept strangely quiet. Who is the real boss of the P4 laboratory?
I believe they're developing them. I think they want to be the most advanced nation on Earth when it comes to biological weapons.
We want the truth.
It's time for the United States to defend itself. The real disease here is communism.
What was the Chinese Communist Party trying to hide?
As the Chinese ambassador calls for cooperation, the U.S. State Department is responding with its first requests. NTD's Tiffany Meyer has the details.
The Chinese ambassador to the U.S. is calling for the U.S. and China to work together instead of blaming each other. This after the regime blaming the U.S. for bringing the virus to China, a claim they have since retracted. On April 7th, the U.S. State Department told Beijing to put its words into action. And 1, share virus data. 2, let international teams investigate how the outbreak began in China. And 3, allow Chinese citizens freedom of speech. She added true cooperation requires transparency and real actions, not just rhetoric. And Wuhan lifted the lockdown on April 8th. Radio Free Asia is reporting that authorities are trying to create the illusion of victory against the epidemic by kicking virus patients out of hospitals before they have recovered. It tells the story of a 69-year-old resident who was discharged from a hospital after doctors said he tested negative and had healed. But his daughter says he still had a lung infection and fever. Doctors still had to keep his trachea open for treatment and provide other critical care. Recovered patients usually go to a hotel to self-quarantine for 14 days. But this man was so sick he was transferred to another smaller health center. This center did not have the resources to care for the man and soon declared he would die soon. But the first hospital still refused to admit him again. After his daughter went public about the issue online, the hospital decided to admit him again. His wife told Radio Free Asia that she is upset Wuhan did not warn the public about human-to-human transmission in time. A number of media in China have begun celebrating the so-called victory against the epidemic. They show beautiful river beaches, reopened restaurants, and people filling the streets. But any online comments about the death toll or who should be held accountable in Wuhan are still being promptly deleted.
And some people in Wuhan were so excited to get out of lockdown, they were lining up the night before. NTD's Juliet Song reports.
Tens of thousands of people are rushing to leave Wuhan after authorities lifted a 2-month lockdown. A video posted on social media shows cars blaring horns together as they leave highway toll stations. Miss Liu is one of those who have left. She lined up at the checkpoints around midnight. Stuck in Wuhan for almost 80 days, she is ready to go home. We've given her a pseudonym and distorted her voice to protect her identity.
Right now, the policy is unpredictable. Since the policy has changed, leave now while you still can. The policy is changing constantly. I wouldn't be able to bear it if they put the city under lockdown again.
Liu said she saw hundreds of cars coming behind her when she left. At least 65,000 people were expected to leave the city on Wednesday, based on data from the Railway and Aviation Administrations. Ms. Liu was over 300 miles away from Wuhan when she spoke to us on the road.
I feel okay, pretty good. Finally, I can go back home. I can live in a spacious place. I'm happy even if I have to self-quarantine at home. At least I can go back to my own home.
Mr. Chen lives in Wuhan and used to work in a neighboring province. He also left after the restriction was lifted.
Leave as soon as possible. Who knows if there will be other restrictions tomorrow.
Residents in other regions are not so happy about the end of lockdown, fearing virus carriers will come from Wuhan.
People in Shanghai are really worried, I tell you. Several WeChat groups I'm in are all talking about this. They're all concerned about asymptomatic carriers from Wuhan.
Wuhan's Tianhe Airport has resumed its operations, but authorities say flights between Hubei and Beijing are still suspended due to, quote, necessary virus outbreak prevention and control efforts. Reporting by Xiahua Gu and Juliet Song, NTD News.
Many Wuhan residents are still afraid as asymptomatic cases keep rising. NTD's Shiwen Rong has the story.
while Chinese state media shows a celebration of Wuhan's borders reopening after 2 months of lockdown, some areas are still restricted. A netizen posted a video saying on April 8th, the Hanhua community in Wuhan was sealed shut again and people were not allowed to leave. There are new suspected cases of infection. On the same day, videos circulated showing an unconscious person lying on the ground on a street in Wuhan. Police and people in full protective suits look on. Official reports show that some communities in Wuhan have asymptomatic carriers, but the Chinese regime isn't counting them as confirmed cases. On April 6th, state-run media Xinhua quoted the Hubei provincial government, saying that in Wuhan, 70 residential areas lost their virus-free designation after authorities detected asymptomatic carriers living there. A Wuhan resident told us lifting quarantine doesn't change people's freedom much. It mostly affects citizens working outside Wuhan. For a resident to leave their homes to work, they need a special certificate from their company to let them leave and return into the residential area. Another certificate is needed to go buy groceries, and they can only stay out for a maximum of 2 hours. They say these restrictions will last till the end of April. As more and more asymptomatic carriers are detected, some China analysts worry that a larger outbreak may be unavoidable, especially since the epicenter has opened its borders and Wuhan authorities are encouraging people to go back to work. Reporting by Shu Wenrong, NTD News.
Coming up, the CCP virus pandemic is hurting the U.S. oil industry. Oil stockpiles are too high and demand is too low as people choose to stay home. More on that after the break.
Viewers have described China Uncensored like The Daily Show, but about China.
At the beginning, I was super excited when I got 500 views, and now the show's grown to about 500,000 subscribers on YouTube. One episode reached 7.9 million people. I'm a little freaked out that many people have seen my face. In 5 years, I see China Uncensored as the sole source of edutainment worldwide.
The U.S. oil market is suffering under the pandemic. The crude oil stockpiles are way up while demand is down as producers try to adjust oil production.
U.S. crude oil stockpiles soared while fuel demand slumped last week, each by their most in a single week ever. The oil industry is feeling the brunt of efforts to stem the spread of the CCP virus. Oil markets crashed as the pandemic sapped fuel demand. Commercial aviation is virtually shut down worldwide. Gasoline demand plummeted as people stay at home and businesses remain shuttered. U.S. fuel demand has dropped by about 1/3 within the last 3 weeks, marking last week's record-breaking fall of 3.4 million barrels per day. The demand decline for gasoline has been especially sharp, which has been cut nearly in half in the last 3 weeks alone. The weekly figures on refining activity and oil production show the industry making painful adjustments to throttle back activities. Worldwide demand is expected to drop by roughly 30%. U.S. refiners are now operating at just over 75% capacity, the lowest rate since September 2008. Production was cut by 600,000 barrels per day.
The World Trade Organization saying today that there could be an ugly drop in international trade. It said exports from North America to Asia could get hit the worst.
While trade is expected to rebound this year, the World Trade Organization is predicting a drop in the aftermath of the pandemic. The WTO said trade could fall this year by 13 to 32%. That's a bigger drop than in the last recession. But that wide range means uncertainty and reflects the unpredictable nature of the pandemic. The WTO said trade in all regions may see double-digit declines, especially exports from North America and Asia. Electronics, automotive, and other industries like them could see bigger drops because of transport and travel restrictions. But the organization said the rebound in global trade could be 21 to 24%, depending largely on how long the crisis lasts and how each nation responds.
Coming up, we find out how some are coping with social distancing measures. Hear from a psychologist about the best ways to lift your spirits, and more after the break. Self-isolation can be a tough adjustment, whether you're trying to support loved ones who are alone or you're made to isolate yourself. Here are some simple approaches to help ease the emotional burden.
Avoiding contact with others for prolonged time is a new situation we're facing in society, and it hasn't been an easy adjustment.
It's a really big change. It's so different than what I'm used to.
Social distancing for me has been really hard because I miss my friends from school and I want to see them again.
Clinical psychologist Dr. Gardere explains it may evoke feelings of anxiety, depression, or other unpleasant emotions.
Those of us who are at home and have to stay at home, it's easy to lose a sense of self because we're completely thrown off of our routines.
Being gone from school this long throws me off, and I don't know what day it is sometimes.
That, coupled with fear and uncertainty about the future, can be difficult to cope with. But Dr. Gardere says keeping up a routine is key.
Where they don't lounge around in pajamas and actually wear casual clothing so that they have some purpose in their lives. And of course, exercise, regular meals.
He says it's a good idea to do similar things at home that you'd normally do at work or school.
And do school from 8:30 to 3:40, just like I normally would physically going to school, just now it's in a different form.
And another tip from psychologists, keep spirits high by staying in touch with loved ones, helping to make the isolation a little less isolating. Melina Weiskup, NTD News, New York.
And that's all for today's news. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Stephanie Cox.